There is a highly specific, dangerous mutation of human behavior that happens when you push a psychological anchor past their breaking point. Look around this room. Think about the person in your life who feels everything. The one who absorbs your stress, balances your chaos, and gives you third, fourth, and fifth chances when anyone else would have walked away. We call them empaths. We treat them like psychological safety nets. We assume their capacity to forgive is an infinite resource. That is a catastrophic tactical error. What most people fail to understand is that the most dangerous person in the room is not the aggressive, loud alpha demanding attention. The most dangerous person is the one who has quietly mapped your entire psychological landscape while you thought you were taking advantage of them. An empath's mind operates like a highly sophisticated radar system. Every time you lie, every time you manipulate, every time you take a piece of them and offer nothing in return, their system logs the data. They don't react immediately. They don't throw tantrums. They give you grace because they can feel the pain behind your toxic behavior. They understand your trauma better than you do. But grace has a baseline, and when that baseline is violated, something shifts inside their neurology. The emotional receptors shut down, and the analytical mind takes over. If you have ever broken one of these people, you know exactly what follows. It isn't a screaming match. It isn't a dramatic, vengeful retaliation. It is a sudden, freezing, absolute silence. It is the realization that the person who used to look at you with total acceptance now looks at you like a piece of data, a stranger, an insect under a microscope. In the next few minutes, we are going to dissect exactly what happens beneath the surface when an empath decides you are no longer worth saving. We will look at the hidden mechanics of behavioral profiling, the weaponized truth that occurs during a boundary collapse, and the brutal reality of the door slam, a psychological execution from which your ego will never fully recover. If you are currently pushing someone's boundaries, or if you are the one whose boundaries are being eroded, you need to hear what comes next. Because once the line is crossed, there is no negotiation. There is no reset button. Let's look at the data. Most people walk through life playing a visual game. They look at posture. They listen to vocal tones. They try to spot the dominant player in the room. But the real game, the hidden matrix of human interaction, is entirely emotional. Right now, someone in your immediate circle is carrying your emotional weight. They are an empath. They possess a heightened neural sensitivity to the emotional states of others. They are the ones who look at you and say, "What's wrong?" before you've even realized you're having a bad day. You might think you are successfully hiding your flaws, your manipulations, or your microaggressions from them. You aren't. They see it all. They choose to ignore it because they value connection over conflict. But there is a silent ticking clock inside every empath. If you do not understand the precise, brutal psychological shift that occurs when that clock hits zero, you are walking into a behavioral trap of your own making. Pay very close attention to what happens when a person who feels everything decides to feel absolutely nothing for you. We live in a culture that mistakes empathy for weakness. We see someone who cares deeply, who listens intently, and our baseline survival instincts tell us, "I can exploit this. I can use their kindness as a cushion for my worst behavior." This is a massive miscalculation in human profiling. True empathy requires immense psychological stamina. To absorb the ambient anxiety, anger, and grief of the world around you without collapsing requires a spine of steel. The empath isn't vulnerable because they are fragile. They are vulnerable because they are brave enough to leave the door open. But do not confuse an open door with a lack of security. When you consistently mistreat an empath, You aren't just hurting their feelings. You are forcing their brain to run a cost-benefit analysis on your existence. Every time you manipulate them, their subconscious mind notes the baseline deviation. They see the micro-expressions of contempt. They hear the slight shifts in your vocal pitch when you lie. They are profiling you in real time, fueled by the very sensitivity you are exploiting. What happens when the threshold is crossed? In behavioral psychology, we look for the pivot point, the exact moment a subject's primary operating system switches. For an empath, this threshold event is a quiet, internal snap. The moment they realize your toxicity is a deliberate pattern rather than a temporary wound, their brain shifts from the emotional limbic system to the cold, analytical prefrontal cortex. The warmth drains out of the room. The unconditional positive regard they used to blanket you with is instantly revoked. This is not an act of anger. Anger is an emotional investment. This is something far worse. This is total emotional detachment. Suddenly, the person who used to validate your excuses is just staring at you. They are looking at your body language, tracking your eye movements, and seeing your manipulation for exactly what it is: a cheap, desperate play for control. When an empath stops feeling with you, they start looking through you. The consequences of this shift are brutal for one specific reason: the loss of the mirror. An empath acts as a beautiful, distorting mirror that reflects only your best potential back at you. They look at your flaws and see your pain. They look at your mistakes and see your growth. They give you a version of yourself that you don't even deserve. When you break them, that mirror shatters. Suddenly, you are forced to look at yourself through the lens of objective reality. Without their warmth to soften the edges, you see your own selfishness, your own insecurity, and your own weakness. The sudden withdrawal of their validation feels like an emotional starvation. You will scramble. You will try to trigger their guilt. You will use your old manipulation tactics to get a reaction. But it won't work. If you push them to speak, the truth they deliver will be weaponized. Because they know your psychological landscape intimately, they know exactly where your deepest insecurities lie. They won't scream at you. They will calmly, precisely, and with terrifying vocal stability, dissect your character flaws in a way that strips away your entire ego. They know your triggers because they spent months trying to protect you from them. Now, they will simply use them to draw a definitive boundary. The final phase of breaking an empath is what is known as the door slam. It is a psychological execution. They don't block you on social media to get your attention. They block you because you no longer exist in their matrix. They don't talk about you to mutual friends. You have been scrubbed from their internal database. You can apologize, you can send flowers, you can cry, or you can try to recreate the past. It means nothing. Once an empath has intellectually decoupled from your emotional frequency, the door is not just locked. The wall is solid stone. Never break the person who chose to understand your darkness instead of judging it. Because once they turn their light away from you, you will find yourself standing in a cold, dark room, entirely alone with the monster of your own behavior. And that is a psychological debt you cannot afford to pay. To understand the terrifying gravity of pushing an empath to their breaking point, we must first dismantle the prevailing cultural delusion surrounding the nature of their patients. Most people look at an empath, someone who absorbs the ambient anxiety, handles the emotional wreckage of others, and consistently offers a soft landing for bad behavior, and they mistake that baseline gentleness for a systemic lack of awareness or strength. If you are interacting with an empath under the assumption that they simply do not notice your microaggressions, your subtle manipulations, or your emotional withdrawals, You are operating under a catastrophic tactical error. Their patience is not a blind spot. It is not a symptom of low self-esteem, nor is it a desperate need for external validation. It is a conscious, active, and highly sophisticated choice to grant you grace. When an empath interacts with you, their neurological radar is constantly logging data points. They notice the exact millisecond your tone shifts from genuine to performative. They spot the micro-expressions of contempt or selfishness that you think you have masterfully concealed behind a polite smile. They hear the hollow ring in your voice when you offer a half-hearted apology. They possess the rare, exhausting ability to look past the toxic mask you wear and see the precise childhood wound or psychological insecurity that drives your behavior. Because they can feel the pain behind your toxicity, they make a deliberate, strategic decision to override their own boundaries to give you room to heal. They are choosing to absorb the emotional cost of your dysfunction so that you don't have to face it alone. This is the illusion of passivity. Because they do not instantly retaliate, because they do not throw tantrums or demand immediate accountability, the predatory or careless mind assumes the empath is a blank slate upon which they can continuously write their own chaos. You begin to treat their forgiveness as an infinite, free resource. You assume that because they forgave you yesterday, and the month before that, and the year before that, the supply of grace is bottomless. But what you are actually witnessing is not submission. It is a highly controlled containment strategy. The empath is holding open a heavy psychological door for you, burning through their own internal energy reserves to keep the connection alive, waiting to see if you will ever step through into genuine accountability. Every time you exploit that space, every time you take a piece of their warmth and offer nothing but manipulation in return, their analytical mind registers the deficit. They are running a silent, continuous behavioral profile on you. They know exactly what game you are playing, even when you have managed to lie to yourself about your own motives. Their silence is not ignorance. It is the quiet, deliberate observation of a behavioral analyst tracking a subject's descent into irreversible pattern behavior. The moment you mistake their profound capacity for empathy as a green light for exploitation, you have already stepped into the trap. You are accumulating a massive psychological debt, completely unaware that the gentle soul you think you are taking advantage of is actually the only anchor keeping your interpersonal world from collapsing into total isolation. To fully grasp the anatomy of this behavioral collapse, we have to look closely at what occurs at the exact boundary line, the threshold event. When an individual who has spent months or years processing your emotional debris is pushed past their absolute limit, an immediate and irreversible neurological pivot takes place. Up until this precise fraction of a second, the empath's brain has been operating primarily within the limbic system, heavily utilizing mirror neurons to feel your pain, translate your hidden anxieties, and absorb the impact of your worst behavior. They have been filtering your toxicity through a lens of profound emotional investment. But the human mind can only sustain that level of systemic pressure for so long before its primary defense mechanisms trigger a complete systemic override. When that threshold is crossed, the warmth doesn't just fade, it undergoes a violent phase shift. The emotional receptors in the empath's brain completely shut down, and the psychological operating system instantly reroutes all power to the cold, analytical prefrontal cortex. The switch flips from feeling to evaluating. In an instant, they stop processing your emotions entirely. The deep, agonizing empathy that once bound them to your soul is severed with surgical precision. They detach from the bond entirely, moving into a state of absolute psychological objectivity. If you are standing in the room when this threshold event occurs, You will feel a palpable drop in the ambient temperature of the relationship. It is the moment the person who used to hang on your every word suddenly looks at you with the detached interest of an apex predator observing a minor specimen. This is not a state of emotional volatility. It is a state of absolute sobriety. When the empath reaches the threshold, they stop making excuses for your trauma. They stop rationalizing your malicious intent, and they stop validating your self-pity. They see your behavior for exactly what it is, stripped of all the emotional context they used to blanket it with. You are no longer a broken soul who needs saving. You are simply a toxic liability that needs to be permanently managed and neutralized. The terrifying element of this shift is that it occurs without warning. Because the empath has been absorbing the impact silently for so long, the perpetrator assumes everything is fine right up until the millisecond the boundary collapses. You think you are playing the same old game of push and pull, completely unaware that you have just stepped over an invisible tripwire. Once the threshold event is triggered, the empath's entire assessment of you is rewritten in real time. They begin to review every lie you ever told, every micro-expression of contempt you thought you hid, and every manipulative tactic you used, but this time, they see the data points with absolute clarity. The protective shield they placed over your flaws is gone. They are no longer looking at your potential. They are staring directly at your current reality. You can see it in their eyes, the immediate disappearance of warmth, the stabilization of their posture, and the heavy, chilling calm that settles into their vocal cadence. They have completely ceased to care about how their reactions affect your feelings, because your feelings have officially been categorized as irrelevant data within their psychological landscape. The culmination of this psychological shift is a phenomenon known in behavioral circles as the door slam, and it is one of the most chilling executions of boundary enforcement you will ever witness. Most people are accustomed to traditional relationship endings, which are characterized by high emotional volatility. We expect shouting matches, tearful ultimatums, dramatic confrontations, or at the very least, a chaotic back and forth where boundaries are tested and renegotiated. These explosive reactions are actually signs of continued emotional investment. Anger, resentment, and even malice require a tremendous amount of psychological energy. When someone fights with you, they are still actively trying to fix the connection or punish you into compliance. But when you break an empath, you do not get fireworks. You do not get the satisfaction of a dramatic scene that validates your ego. You get a sudden, absolute, freezing silence that signals the total deletion of your existence from their internal database. The door slam is an act of quiet, permanent erasure. Unlike a regular person who walks away while still carrying the emotional residue of the relationship, an empath slams the door only after they have entirely cleared the ledger. They do not leave because they are angry. They leave because they have become entirely indifferent. The emotional cord that once connected their nervous system to yours has not just been dropped, it has been vaporized. When this happens, there is no grand announcement. They do not block you on social media to send a passive-aggressive message or trigger your abandonment issues. They block you simply because you have become irrelevant data that no longer belongs in their field of vision. If you pass them on the street, they will not look away in awkward discomfort or glare at you with hidden resentment. They will look directly through you, their eyes reflecting the terrifying reality that you have been reduced to a complete stranger. What makes this consequence so brutal for the perpetrator is the absolute impossibility of negotiation. The human ego is designed to believe it can talk its way out of anything, that it can leverage past intimacy to manipulate its way back into someone's good graces. You expect to use your old tricks, the practiced vulnerability, the superficial apologies, the strategic guilt-tripping, to crack open the door just enough to regain control. But when you attempt these tactics on an empath who has slammed the door, you will find yourself hitting solid, unyielding stone. Your words will bounce off them like background noise. They will listen to your pleas with a calm, detached stability that will make your skin crawl, because they are no longer reacting to your emotional frequency. They have run the diagnostic metrics on your character, concluded that you are a net negative asset to their psychological survival, and executed a permanent systemic wipe. There is no lingering nostalgia, no secret yearning for the good old days, and no hidden reserve of hidden affection waiting to be tapped. The deletion is absolute, clinical, and irreversible. To truly understand why breaking an empath yields such a brutal aftermath, you have to look past their actions and examine the psychological vacuum left behind in the perpetrator's own mind. This is known as the mirror effect. When you are in a relationship with an empath, whether it is romantic, professional, or platonic, they act as a highly specialized, flattering mirror for your ego. Because of their profound capacity for unconditional positive regard, they naturally look at you through the lens of your highest potential. They see your character flaws, your deep-seated insecurities, and your emotional dysfunctions, but instead of judging them, they wrap them in a blanket of absolute validation. They choose to interpret your selfishness as a defense mechanism, your anger as a cry for help, and your manipulation as a product of past trauma. In essence, they provide you with a beautiful, warped reflection that makes you feel validated, understood, and fundamentally safe from your own darkness. The brutality of breaking them is that you instantly shatter this mirror. The moment you push them past that terminal threshold, the warmth is permanently withdrawn, and the flattering distortion disappears. Suddenly, you are no longer looking at yourself through their grace. You are forced to look at yourself through the lens of raw, unadulterated reality. Without their emotional cushion to soften the edges, you are suddenly confronted with the cold truth of who you actually are. You realize that your calculated maneuvers were transparent, your lies were obvious, and your behavior was entirely toxic. The vacuum left by their departure creates an immense psychological shockwave. The sudden absence of their validation feels like an immediate emotional starvation, exposing the deep-seated insecurities that you were using their empathy to medicate. This is the psychological trap of the mirror effect. Perpetrators often expect an empath's breaking point to result in a vindictive counterattack, a smear campaign, or an act of overt revenge. They prepare themselves for battle because a battle validates their ego and allows them to play the victim. But the empath doesn't engage in revenge. The true consequence is far more devastating. They simply hold up a flat, objective mirror and force you to sit alone with your own choices. When they withdraw their energy, they leave you entirely alone with the monster of your own behavior. You are left frantically trying to provoke a reaction, trying to use your old manipulation tactics to elicit a flash of anger or a hint of guilt, anything to prove that you still hold power over their emotional state. But you are met with a chilling, stable neutrality. The weight of this silence forces your mind to turn inward. You begin to replay every interaction, every microaggression, and every broken promise, but this time without the comforting buffer of their forgiveness. You are forced to witness the precise moments you chose to exploit a person who only wanted to protect you. The comforting narrative you constructed about being a good person who just makes mistakes completely unravels, leaving behind the jagged reality of your own selfishness. This cold reflection is a form of psychological torment from which your ego cannot easily recover, because you cannot fight an enemy that isn't fighting back. You are simply drowning in the quiet, undeniable proof of your own toxicity, staring into a shattered mirror that refuses to lie to you ever again. When you systematically erode the boundaries of an empath, the ultimate consequence you face is the permanent loss of an invaluable psychological ally and the creation of a permanent stranger who possesses a total, unvarnished blueprint of your mind. In the realm of behavioral intelligence, having someone in your life who can read your emotional baseline, anticipate your needs, and decode your unspoken anxieties is the ultimate strategic asset. An empath is essentially a highly sophisticated, organic tracking system for human behavior, running in the background of your life to stabilize your environment, absorb your collateral damage, and cushion the impact of your worst decisions. They choose to position themselves between you and the harsh realities of your own personality defects, acting as a buffer that protects you from the social and psychological consequences of your actions. When you cross that final, definitive boundary, you aren't just ending a relationship, you are permanently terminating a vital line of psychological defense. The tragedy of this loss becomes apparent the moment the empath detaches and switches into a state of clinical objectivity. Because they spent a vast amount of time deeply attuned to your emotional frequencies, they didn't just listen to your words, they mapped your entire psychological architecture. They know exactly how your ego operates. They understand the precise nature of your defense mechanisms, and they can see through your behavioral patterns with terrifying clarity. When you cross their line, that deep psychological intimacy doesn't vanish. It simply loses its warmth and becomes a cold, unyielding database of information. They go from being your greatest defender to being the one person in the world who can look right through your mask and see the absolute naked truth of your character. You can no longer hide from them, you can no longer manipulate them, and you can no longer play the victim, because they have a complete operational profile on your behavior. This turns the empath into a permanent stranger, a category of person from whom there is absolutely no return. They do not hold a grudge, nor do they carry an active resentment that you can attempt to soothe with standard behavioral tactics or superficial apologies. Instead, they view you with a chilling, stable indifference that strips away any illusion of power you thought you held over them. When you try to employ your standard conversational loops or emotional triggers to regain entry into their life, you will find that your tactics are entirely transparent to them. They see the micro-expressions of your desperation, they track the vocal shifts of your performative remorse, and they dismantle your attempts at guilt-tripping before you can even finish your sentence. Your entire behavioral toolkit becomes completely useless against a person who knows exactly why you are using it. The long-term cost of this violation is a profound, lingering isolation for the perpetrator. You are left with the sobering realization that you have permanently alienated the one person who was willing to witness your darkest, most dysfunctional traits and still offer you unconditional positive regard. In a world full of superficial connections and transactional relationships, the empath was the only entity operating outside of that economy, offering a safe harbor where your ego could rest. By breaking them, you force them to adapt, to harden their exterior, and to lock you out of their psychological matrix forever. You are cast out of the warmth of their grace and forced to navigate your own chaos completely alone, fully aware that somewhere out there is a person who knows every single one of your secrets, every one of your flaws, and every one of your weaknesses, and who has consciously decided that you are no longer worth a single drop of their energy.